I'm Elizabeth Horner. I'm the Associate Museum Director for Public Programs here at the Carlos, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you. I'd like to take a moment to share Emory University's land acknowledgement before we begin. Emory University acknowledges the Muskogee Creek people who lived, worked, produced knowledge on, and nurtured the land where Emory's Oxford and Atlanta campuses are now located. We recognize the sustained oppression, land dispossession, and involuntary removals of the Muskogee and Cherokee peoples from Georgia and the Southeast. Emory seeks to honor the Muskogee Nation and other indigenous caretakers of this land by humbly seeking knowledge of their histories and committing to respectful stewardship of the land. Tonight, we have gathered to hear from one of the Carlos's and one of my dearest friends and favorite speakers, Dr. Sara McClintock. Sara is a Buddhist philosopher and scholar of religion whose interests converge at the intersections of ethics, metaphysics, truth, and story. Having earned their BA in Fine Arts from Bryn Mawr College, a Master's of Theological Studies in World Religion from Harvard Divinity School, and a PhD in Religion from Harvard University, she joined the Emory faculty in 2005, where she is now Associate Professor in the Department of Religion. Since Sara has arrived at Emory, it has been my great pleasure to work with her on the development of educational programs and materials for audiences of all ages, multiple exhibitions of South Asian art, and a major renovation of our Asian galleries. Sara has authored and edited books and articles too many to mention here, and many which I can't pronounce. But tonight we celebrate her newest publication, a translation of Nāgārjuna's Ratnāvalī, or Precious Garland. The 2nd century Indian Buddhist monk, Nāgārjuna, was famous for his philosophical treatises on emptiness, by which he meant the lack of an intrinsic or fixed identity in things. Less well known are his works addressed to kings, among which the Precious Garland is the longest and most comprehensive. In this work, he explains how a king can resist the inevitable lures of wealth and power to undertake works of genuine compassion and goodness in the world. It is not at all surprising that Sara, one of the most compassionate people I have ever met, would be interested in this topic. So please join me in welcoming her to discuss it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Elizabeth. That was so generous and sweet. It's so lovely to be back here and speaking to you and seeing a lot of old and new friends. I can't see the audience that well, but I glanced around. I saw a lot of my students here and colleagues and some of the docents. It's just great to be here. So thank you very much. I'm aware that I probably need to keep track of the time, so I'm going to grab my phone. Yeah. Because this is a very rich, as you mentioned, a long and comprehensive treatise. And there's a lot to say about it, and I certainly won't be able to cover everything that there is to know about this interesting text tonight. But I do hope my aim is to introduce you a little bit to Nāgārjuna, to the Precious Garland, this text that has just been translated, and to some of the ideas, also a little bit about my own process in coming to make this translation, the cover of the book, this cover image, which we will discuss briefly. There'll be a little bit of an art historical component to the talk, a fair bit of philosophy, and I might not get to finish because due to various factors, I wasn't able to sort of hone the talk quite as I had wanted. But the basic topic that I laid out initially, navigating power, is still in this talk. But I think that I still have more to do to think about this, because actually this is a fairly difficult text. It is, as I will explain to you. So let me just go forward here. And introduce to you the author of the text, Nāgārjuna. Nāgārjuna was an Indian Buddhist monk who lived, we believe, in the 2nd century CE of the Common Era. And interestingly enough, one of the ways that we have been able to date him, because it's notoriously difficult to date Indian philosophers and thinkers, but one of the ways that we've been able to date him is due to this very text that I'm going to be discussing tonight, and through some of the art historical details that are mentioned in the text. So I think the docents here and art historians here will find that particularly interesting. He likely lived in South India. And again, there are a number of historical factors that go into making that claim, which you can read about in my book if you want. There's a whole section on situating Nāgārjuna. And he's also renowned as the founder of Madhyamaka. Madhyamaka is a particular stream or school of Indian Buddhist philosophical thought. Madhyamaka means of the middle. So I don't really like the translation middling because it sounds sort of mediocre, but I've toyed with that translation. Others have translated it as the middle way, philosophy of the middle way, philosophy of the middle. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that is, but in short, the Buddhist tradition is renowned for being a middle way between different kinds of extremes, including, for example, the extreme of hedonism or kind of rash indulgence of sense pleasures on one side, and an extreme of harsh asceticism. The Buddha is famous for counseling a middle path between these different modes of practice, but it's also a middle way metaphysically speaking, or ontologically speaking, a middle way between an extreme of existence and an extreme of non-existence. We'll talk a little more about what that means. It's complex material, but Nāgārjuna is the one who's known for being the founder of a very rich philosophical tradition that has persisted to the present day, been particularly influential in Tibet, but also in East Asia. And he is also famed for having brought back the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras from the world of the Nagas. And as you can see in this picture here, which is a modern depiction by Robert Beer, there is Nāgārjuna holding a text. That long piece of that long set of papers in his hands is a manuscript, probably a palm leaf manuscript. And in the waters beneath are these serpent-like figures who the Nagas were supposedly given these sutras, these sacred texts, to hold, because while the Mahayana practitioners felt that the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras had been taught by the historical Buddha, they also maintained that the vast majority of the Buddha's disciples were not ready to hear its profound message of emptiness, that is, the lack of a fixed existence or inherent existence, as Elizabeth mentioned. And so they were designated to be held by the Nagas, and Nāgārjuna, whose name even includes that word, got them back. So we see lots of depictions of Nāgārjuna with Nagas or snakes around him, as in this image from Tibet. And he became a figure who's kind of larger than life. There are a huge number of texts attributed to Nāgārjuna, or given the author's name, Nāgārjuna, in the Tibetan canon, for example, a huge number. But there are some that really rise to the top in terms of their fame and their importance. And Tibetans have tried to figure out various ways of classifying Nāgārjuna's works. The one famous way, is to break them into three collections. The reasoning collection, which would be the texts that are focusing mainly on emptiness, this lack of inherent existence, this middle path, metaphysically speaking, between existence and non-existence. The most famous of those texts is the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, the root verses of the Middle Way. And my students had to read some of those very difficult verses last week. But some of you may have encountered that text. There are a number of them. Then the homiletic collection, focusing on advice or sermons, and that includes a number of letters to kings and other such things, or letters, the letter to a friend is a good one. And these usually are aimed at giving advice to lay people. So not the monastics, but those disciples of the Buddha who are not yet ready to don monastic robes, shave their head, and practice the austerities, not extreme austerities, but the austerities of the Buddhist middle way, which involve things like keeping celibate, not eating after noon, and so on. But for those of us who are not there yet, not in this lifetime, in any case, there's lots of other advice, and we're going to see some of that tonight. And then the hymn collection, which focuses on offerings of praise to the Buddhas and the bodhisattvas, those beings who are on the path to Buddhahood. And then beyond that, there's a lot of other text attributed to Nāgārjuna. Modern scholars might say these texts are later and probably were not authored by the same person. Some modern scholars have postulated two Nāgārjunas and so on. Some of these are tantric texts giving esoteric teachings. We won't really discuss that today because we're trying to stay in these early materials around the 2nd century CE. And so the Precious Garland, the text that we're going to look at tonight, the Ratnāvalī, is addressed by a monk to a powerful king, probably of the Satavahana dynasty, which is a South Indian dynasty, during this period. And the image here that you see is not of a Satavahana king. It comes from a stupa in South India, in which we see a king, Ajatashatru, a famous king from the early sutras, or suttas in Pali. But I wanted you to see that the idea of, and he's on his way to visit the Buddha. And I wanted you to see that the idea that Buddhist monks would have conversations with kings or persons of royal personage or of power is a common theme in Buddhist literature. And so this idea of a letter or a sermon to a king is not so unusual. But nevertheless, the text, the Ratnāvalī, the Precious Garland, it does defy easy classification, and we're going to see why that is. But the main reason being that the other homiletic texts of this kind, which are styled often as letters, and so on, they tend to avoid the really difficult metaphysical argumentation that you find in the collection of reasoning. But this text does not avoid it at all. This madhyamaka, middle path metaphysical speculation is very front and center in the text, along with the ordinary advice for the king as a person of power. So we're going to see how that works. But this text, which defies easy classification, and in fact, we see the Tibetans having a great deal of difficulty placing it there are disagreements about where it belongs, but it champions both Madhyamaka and also Mahayana, this new form of Buddhism that's arising with the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras around the time of Nāgārjuna's activity in India, that is championing the way of the bodhisattva, stating that the Mahayana, which literally means great vehicle, is the appropriate path, the best path, which is, it's the path of altruism, and that one should not be satisfied with a kind of basic alleviation of one's own suffering, but one should strive to build oneself up with the merit that is required to become a full-fledged Buddha, somebody who's capable of being maximally efficacious in spreading the Dharma, the Buddha's teachings, to the maximal number of sentient beings possible. And I say sentient beings because the Buddha teaches not only humans, but also gods, nagas, animals, and so on, can all learn from a Buddha. So our text, the Ratnāvalī, was written in Sanskrit, composed in Sanskrit. It was probably composed orally, but we don't really know that much about how texts were written back in those days. But in terms of what's come down to us today, as with many Indian Buddhist texts, they don't always survive in their original languages. And many Indian Buddhist texts from Nāgārjuna's time and before and after have only come down to us, are only available to us now in other languages, like most prominently Tibetan or Chinese. And so we see that when we do find a text where the Sanskrit has survived, people are very excited about that, because not only does it make it available to more scholars, because not every scholar of Indian philosophy has studied Tibetan or Chinese, but also it makes you feel like you're getting a little closer to what maybe the person had originally said, even though we know textual transmission is complicated and things change over time. And in those cases where we have multiple manuscripts of a single Sanskrit text, there's lots of variations, and that's the job of critical editions. In this case, for the Ratnāvalī, until very, very recently, we really only have had one witness, one Sanskrit manuscript, and that was preserved in Nepal, and it was partial. 233 verses out of a total of 500 verses only survived, and these were examined, and it wasn't even the actual palm leaf manuscript, but a copy of the palm leaf manuscript, so a hand-copied document, were examined by the Italian Indologist and scholar of Buddhism, Giuseppe Tucci, with the permission of the Maharaja Juddha Shumsher Jung Bahadur, who was also considered the prime minister of Nepal at that time. And Tucci compared what he found there with the various Tibetan translations that have come down to us, because there's more than one. And he made a critical edition of the available verses, plus an English translation of only of the verses that survived in Sanskrit. And he published that in the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland in installments in 1934 and 1936. Then, much down the road, Michael Hahn, a wonderful German scholar who specialized especially in these kind of homiletic texts, not just of Nāgārjuna's, but of a number, these texts of advice to lay people and to kings in particular. Michael Hahn did a revised Sanskrit edition, a new critical edition that he published in 1982, which was based on a re-examination of Tucci's paper copy, which he was able to see directly when he went to Nepal as well, compared with the Tibetan translations, including some new materials that he found. And he also later did some further revisions after he got access to the actual palm leaf manuscript. So this is all by way of explaining to you what I was working with. I was working with already critically edited materials, which was a great blessing, honestly. Another incredibly valuable work that came out in 1990 was by my good friend, Geshe Ngawang Samten, who is a remarkable Tibetan scholar who also knows Sanskrit, which is not that common among Tibetan scholars. I knew him in Sarnath, India, where I did some of my doctoral research at the Central Institute for Higher Tibetan Studies, now a university. And he did a critical edition of the Tibetan translation. However, he did reference Hahn's Sanskrit edition. And he also this edition also includes a 9th century Indian commentary, but that survives only in Tibetan. That's the confusing part. So this is a Sanskrit commentary. The Sanskrit's lost. We have Tibetan now. Geshe Ngawang Samten, being a scholar of Indian texts, was able to critically edit that. And this commentary is by Ajita Mitra. And so based on the Tibetan translations, Hahn's critical edition, and the Sanskrit manuscript of Nepal, he was able to put together this wonderful, very, very erudite Tibetan edition. And at the end of the book actually includes photos of the Sanskrit manuscript. So all of that was what went into my translation with my co-translator, John Dunn. Some of you know him. He was a scholar here, and we were in grad school together. So way, way back in 1997, John and I were asked to produce a translation of the Precious Garland for a public lecture that the Dalai Lama was giving in Los Angeles. And this was a sponsored translation. with the idea that there would be special books prepared to be passed out for free to the audience. This was back when the Dalai Lama was still a pretty big celebrity in America, hadn't been here that many times. And I believe about 3,000 people attended, and it was in a big kind of arena. So we based on all those materials that I've just described to you, the Sanskrit of the 233 verses as edited by Tucci and Han, and then the Tibetan of those same materials plus the other verses as edited by Geshe-Ngawang Samten. And we also looked back at the translations. We produced a translation, but we prioritized the Tibetan transmission of these verses. We did, even though we looked at the Sanskrit, when there was a discrepancy, which there often was, we prioritized the Tibetan because we knew this was going to be an oral teaching. The Dalai Lama wasn't going to have access to the Sanskrit. Unlike Geshe-Ngawang Samten, Dalai Lama doesn't read Sanskrit. And we also prioritized the Tibetan commentarial tradition. So that really made the translation have a certain kind of a slant to it. And that's what we did. And much later now, 2024, this book has just come out like today, I guess, just the last couple of days. It's now for sale. We just, so for many years, we let the project lie fallow. And then in the last number of years, we got back together and over Zoom, and we started, working on our revisions. And again, we used the same materials, but we prioritized the Sanskrit, and we prioritized the voice of the Indian commentary, even though that Indian commentary is only available in Tibetan. So you can see it's quite complex linguistically. And this book that we have now produced, which has a lovely cover, which I'll talk about in a minute, includes also working editions of the Sanskrit and the available Sanskrit and the Tibetan. A working edition here means we are drawing on those critical editions, and where we have a disagreement, we put in a note. So there's some text critical notes in the book, but for the most part, we're using Han, we're using Samten, as our basis. But we wanted to include that here for scholars now to have easy access to the texts, and a 75-page introductory essay on the contents of the text, which I'll be getting to now. Okay. The image. Everyone loves the cover. I love the cover. I love the image. When we were trying to find the right image for this book, we were trying to look for something from South India, from the 2nd century that would be appropriate. And we really struggled to find the right image. And at a certain point, it dawned on us that we had the right image right here in the Carlos Museum. Now, this image is from the 2nd century. So the time is perfect. It is not from South India. It's from Gandhara. So Gandhara is in the north. It is in present day Pakistan. It is in probably somewhere near what you might have heard of the Swat Valley. That's basically the region that we're talking about, where there was a flourishing of Buddhist art and Buddhist culture in this time period, and where we see some of the very first sculptures of the Buddha that ever were made. Because in the early part of Buddhism, people didn't make Buddha statues. They felt that wasn't actually even appropriate because the Buddha wasn't something that could be, his form couldn't be captured in stone. But this is not the Buddha. This is the Prince Siddhartha. So a lot of you already know the story of the Buddha. I say the Buddha, meaning the Buddha of our age. Tibetans will say our teacher. The Buddha, the person that comes to be known as the Buddha for us. Buddhists believe there have been many other Buddhas, and there still will be many more, and even are many more now in this great multiverse. But our Buddha was a bodhisattva first, which is typical, right? That's what a bodhisattva is, someone who's destined for becoming this really amazing, perfect, awakened being who's able to help so many others. And in his final lifetime as a human, the lifetime when he attains that amazing awakening, he's born as a prince or somebody of great prestige and power, a wealthy person into the kshatriya caste or class, as we say. And this is an image of that bodhisattva before he becomes the Buddha. He's there in the palace with his ornamentation, his royal ornamentation. You see the earrings, you see the armbands, you see the necklaces, the pearls, the turban, the lion turban. It's a very regal person. And I think it fits very well with this book, because in this book, what we have is a Buddhist monk who would not look like this, right? A Buddhist monk and the Buddha did not look like this. This is the Buddha before he cut his hair, before he takes off his ornaments, before he leaves the palace, before he renounces power. He's still in the palace, but he's wondering, is this the path? Should I stay in the palace and try to help sentient beings using my royal power? Or should I take off these ornaments and live a simple life and go a different route and become a spiritual teacher? That's the path he chose. But we'll see what the king that Nāgārjuna addresses in this book. What path does he choose? That's harder to say. I mentioned that the Precious Garland is 500 verses long, and this verse is 2 verses from the end. So chapter 5, verse 98. But I start with it because I think it's very important to recognize that even though the book is addressed to a king, it is meant to be taken as advice for us all in some regard. And he says, this dharma, here, dharma means the teaching. This teaching, however, is not explained just for a king. It is also taught as is appropriate to other beings out of the desire to benefit them. And here Nāgārjuna is showing his commitment to an altruistic modality in which he teaches not just for the king, but for all sentient beings, whoever is able to understand. And we know also that this book is being spoken by a monk, not just because it comes down to us with the name Nāgārjuna attached, but because within the text there are little clues like this one, where the narrator, the voice of the text says, if, to begin with, it is difficult to say something beneficial but unpleasant even to others, how can I, a monk, hope to do so to you, the king of a large realm? So Nāgārjuna is acknowledging here that he does not have a lot of power vis-a-vis the king. The king is the one with the money. The king is the one with the armies. The king is the one with the power to do many different things, right? To wage war, to punish criminals, to raise or lower taxes, to support or not support religious practitioners, including Buddhists. But here he's saying, I'm going to tell you things, and he's very cagey about it, because he knows that some of what he's going to tell the king is not what the king wants to hear, right? Kings generally don't want to hear that they need to be unattached to their wealth or things like that. But that's some of the messaging that he gets from Nāgārjuna is like that. And we see in another part of the text where he says something like, you're not going to like what I'm going to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. And it shows a lot of bravery actually on his part. So the text starts out by breaking the Dharma, the Buddha's teachings, into 2 distinct kinds of Dharma. And this is unique to this text. I'm not aware of this precise rubric appearing in other works. But the general idea of it matches very well with Buddhist philosophical and ethical teachings throughout South Asia. And that is, he talks about the Dharma of ascendance, Abhyudaya, and the Dharma of the highest good, the Nishreyasa. Okay? I don't know if Shreyas is here, but if he is, Nishreyasa, that of which nothing is more glorious. So ascendance here means moving up in status. Okay? Social status for sure. Like a king is a very high social status, but also status in samsara. So having a higher rebirth. In other words, becoming a human being or a god, and not falling into a lower rebirth like a hell being or a ghost or even an animal, which are, sadly, in my view, by traditional Buddhist accounts, a lower rebirth. But here we have his teaching, and he's going to break his teaching into these two kinds of teachings. One teaching that's aimed at just improving your lot in life. One teaching that's aimed at what he calls the highest good, which we're going to find out is a kind of more extreme liberation from ordinary life. So first he says, in whom there is first the dharma of ascendance, afterward arises the highest good. So he's putting these in an order. First, you go after the kind of teaching that gets you, that moves you up the ladder, so to speak, and keeps you out of hell, which is a huge preoccupation of Buddhists in this period. And afterwards arises the highest good. You have to have a certain status. You have to at least be kind of a human to be able to do this path that's going to take you to Buddhahood, for example. And the reasoning is, since after reaching ascendance, one proceeds gradually to the highest good. And here we maintain that ascendance is happiness and the highest good is liberation. Okay, so this ascendance, this having a good station in life. Again, this isn't just about being a king, although we'll see that being a king is considered to be the result of practicing this this dharma of ascendance. But having fewer problems in life, having a better station in life is considered happiness. You know, you have what you need. You have good health. You have a roof over your head. You have these things. That's considered sukha, the opposite of dukkha, the opposite of suffering. We maintain that ascendance is happiness and the highest good is liberation. So that goes beyond it. Happiness is all well and good, and we should go for it. But for a monk or a nun, there's an even higher goal. That's the dharma of the highest good. So, and in brief, faith and wisdom are the concise methods for attaining them. So with faith, you do this path of the layperson to get to a kind of happiness, and wisdom is going to get you the highest good. Through faith, one partakes of the dharma. That's, it's faith that's going to allow you to even, go and ask for teachings, make offerings to a teacher and gain some merit, make offerings to monks and nuns and gain some merit that's going to help you on your path, in this kind of more worldly version of the dharma. And through wisdom, one truly understands. Of these two, wisdom is foremost, yet faith is its prerequisite. So he's not denigrating this dharma of ascendance. He's saying it's a necessary prerequisite. And if you just want to stay there in this lifetime, that's fine. This is not something that you have to necessarily advance to the dharma of the highest good in this lifetime. You've got plenty of lifetimes. Remember, or maybe you don't know, but there's no beginning to rebirth. So we've been doing this for a long, long time, according to these early Buddhists. We might need to keep doing it for quite a while too, before we become a Buddha. Now, he's going to start the text with about 20 verses, not quite, on the Dharma of Ascendance. Very simple. We're going to break it down. What is it? What is this kind of Dharma of Ascendance? It basically comes down to being like a good person, right? Refrain from all non-virtue and continuously engage in virtue through mind, body, and speech. Body, speech, and mind, the three doors of action or karma. What you do with your body matters. What you say with your voice matters. That's you. And what you think with your mind matters. Thinking is an action, and it creates realities. So does moving, so does speaking. We should continuously make all of our actions virtuous and refrain from none. So he gives a long section about what that exactly involves. And we won't go, you have to buy the book and read it, I guess, but you can find out what does that involve to do virtue and to refrain from non-virtue. But through this, doing all these things, just like I was saying before, you're freed from rebirth as a hell being, hungry ghost, or animal. And as a human or celestial being, you will obtain abundant happiness, glory, and sovereignty, kingship. So power, kingship, is the result of good deeds, right? Those good deeds and that kingship doesn't get you out of samsara, the world of suffering, but it gets you a little further along. Now we're going to move, and this is what's very interesting. We have 100 verses on the Dharma of the highest good. This is where you might want to buckle your seatbelt, because it gets really confusing and hard. And it's so interesting. And people have wondered, why is Nāgārjuna giving this really difficult metaphysical teaching to a king? The other texts that we have, not just attributed to him, but attributed to him and to others that are addressed to kings or that are of this kind of sermon genre, they don't do this. They stick with, this is virtue, this is non-virtue, tell the truth, don't commit sexual misconduct, all the advice. But here, very close to the beginning of the book, we have a long section on these sort of metaphysical teachings of emptiness, no self, and so on. And nobody really has given a full explanation as to why. I think I also don't know. But I think it makes the text really interesting. It makes the text, it complexifies this text quite a bit. I think we see that he believes that the king is capable of understanding. Maybe he's trying to get the king to renounce the kingdom. Maybe he's not. We're going to see in a minute that there's a couple of different ways you could interpret it. So he starts out in this 100-verse section. The victors, that's the Buddhas of old, including our teacher, the Buddha, our Buddha. But the victors said that the Dharma of the highest good, which is subtle and appear profound, is frightening to unlearned, childish beings. And I think this is really interesting. The teachings of emptiness, no self, impermanence, in these core teachings that are supposed to liberate you from your clinging to existence are frightening for ordinary persons, right? And what he says, and here we have, I think, which is my favorite verse in the whole text. It says, well, actually, I'm going to read it to you in Sanskrit because I dislike it so much, and then we'll read the English. So he says, Nasmyaham na bhavishyami, na mesti na bhavishyati, itti balasya santrasa, panditasya bhayakshaya. I am not, this is in quote, I am not, nor will I be. There is nothing that is mine, nor will there be. This teaching terrifies the childish. For the wise, it puts an end to fear. I am not, nor will I be. It sounds very nihilistic. There is nothing that is mine, nor will there be. It's a bit scary. If we are childish beings and we're immature, it is frightening. He acknowledges. For the wise, this teaching puts an end to fear. There's nothing to be afraid of because we've let go, right? We've let go of clinging to this self that we think we have. The aggregates. Now we're getting into philosophy. Aggregates here refers to all the components of our personal existence. The Sanskrit word is skanda, and that literally means a heap or a pile. It's kind of like Hume's bundle theory. There's nothing at the core. There's an endless stream of factors that are giving rise in moment to moment to our experience. And these aggregates, he's now saying they arise from the habitual, quote, I. So when you say the quote marks, that's showing you that we're talking about a concept, an idea, not something fully real. Of course, concepts have their reality and they need to be respected in terms of their power, but they also are deeply misleading. So the aggregates arise from the habitual I. This is a very confusing line because you might think it goes the other way around, but we'll see in a minute. They're mutually conditioning. So the factors of our existence only arise because we are clinging to an idea of self, and the habitual I is actually false. Its seed is false. So how can it actually grow? This is an argument to try to convince you that you have no self because there's nothing there to actually bring it about. Now, this is going to go over your head. Some of you, don't worry about it. It went over the king's head most likely. eventually he gets back to giving the king good old ordinary advice. But it's important to know that he's giving this really hard teaching to the king right at the beginning. And he's saying, seeing in this way that the aggregates, the factors that make up our experience are unreal, that means ultimately unreal, then when you see that, then the habitual I is forsaken. So let me give you an example. Here, one of the aggregates is material form. You could think of your own body. There's a tendency to take your body as something very solid, certainly as mine, right? This is my body, and something that we therefore are very attached to. And at the time of death, that becomes extremely obvious. But even in ordinary life, there's any number of anti-aging creams you can buy. We have a lot of attachment to our own beauty, to our own bodies, and to our youth and to our health and so on. But what he's saying here is that material form is ultimately unreal in the sense that it doesn't have an existence apart from us seeing it as a body. It is produced in some ways through our own perception of it. And it itself is helping give rise to the perception. So this is a philosophical position of mutual causality. And so, seeing in this way that the aggregates are unreal, the habitual I is forsaken or given up. And from the forsaking of the habitual I, the aggregates do not arise again. When you're letting go, when you've let go, and my students will know what I'm talking about, and I say this, when you let go of your understanding of all these things as fixed identities, then you can enter into a kind of signlessness. A signlessness where things are not inherently what we name them as. They're part of a flow. As long as one fixates on the aggregates, through that there will be an I. So when you fixate, you cling to it, you reify it, you thingify it, there will also be an I. And when there's no habitual I, there will be no further karma. Or when there is habitual I, there will be further karma from that comes again. Okay, here we see the idea. These three processes mutually causing each other, the circle of samsara whirls around like the circle formed by a whirling torch without beginning, middle, or end. And here we get the most like kind of Madhyamaka thing of all. This is the tetralemma that you find in the Mula Madhyamaka Karika. But samsara, and samsara just means, our ordinary suffering life, is not found to be produced from itself, from something else, or from both, nor is it found in the three times. The tetralemma will say, an entity is not produced from itself, from something other, from both, or from neither. So it's not exactly the same, but it's very similar. The point is, when we try to find an entity, we can't find it. And Nāgārjuna has a lot of different argumentational tricks to help us understand this fact, that you can't find the entity separate, like if you're talking about cause and effect, the effect can't be found separate from the cause, but the effect and the cause also are not the same. And it's not both the same and different, and it's also not neither. So he does a lot of this kind of argument to try to explode your mind. He's very good at doing that. And through that, the habitual I ceases, and karma and birth also cease. So here we go. Really, neither the world, that's samsara, right? The world, nor nirvana comes into existence, nor goes out of existence, nor do they endure. So these entities, so-called entities, ideas we have, we can't find them. When we look, we can't find them. Upon analysis, they're satisfactory only as long as they're not analyzed. So what kind of distinction could there actually be between the world and nirvana? And this is a point I want to hone in on, because he's saying to the king, everything is empty of a fixed identity. Even you don't exist in the way that you think that you do. The world does not exist in this independent way. But then neither does nirvana, and neither can actually be found, and therefore nirvana here is a synonym for liberation. Therefore, what kind of distinction can there actually be? And this becomes very interesting, because maybe that means you can be a king and be a dharmic king. Maybe you don't have to renounce power. We'll see. Okay. We're going to leave that as long. Okay. Now, the dharma of ascendance comes back for quite a few verses. And he's going to tell you that when you dedicate yourself to doing good works and being virtuous, and you don't worry too much about all this very complicated, confusing Madhyamaka stuff, you just be a good Buddhist, okay? Through that Dharma, you attain fame. Everyone loves you, right? You're great. You're a great king. And pleasure even, right? Good things come to people who treat others well, right? And you have no fear also now or at death, which is lovely. And in the next world too, this is not talking about ending samsara. This is like you're going to be born again. You're going to be born in a heaven probably. You will have great joy. So devote yourself. Dharma is the highest policy. Policy here, niti, is a Sanskrit term for basically politics, okay? Dharma, this dharma of doing good works, being a good person, that's the highest policy. And through dharma, the world is pleased. And a world that is pleased will not deceive you. There's a lot in here about deception and not deceiving others and not being deceived. And this is all based in being an upright person, an ethical person. You treat others right, they're going to treat you right. If you wish to make your I love this one. If you wish to make your foes unhappy, do away with your faults and enhance your good qualities. That way you will gain great benefit and your enemies will also be displeased. So he's not above appealing to the king's desire to sort of get one over on his rivals, right? But he wants him to do it in this crafty way that's actually going to make the king into a better person. So make your foes unhappy by doing away with your own faults. And here is kind of core teaching, Buddhist teaching, but in a fun way. If you scratch an itch, it feels good, but it feels even better to have no itch at all. So too, one is happy to have obtained worldly desires, but there's greater happiness in having no desire at all. So he's trying to coax the king along, away from his attachment to desire. Imagine a king, they have a lot of sense pleasures around. They have everything that they could want, right? There are a lot of temptation. But he's saying, yeah, it feels good to get that, double banana split, ice cream, whatever. But it feels even better if you just don't even care. You don't want it. You don't need it. You're good. You're good. Okay. We have a small section on the bodhisattva's infinite merit and wisdom, which I will only give you one verse from. This is actually core to the text, though, because what he's saying to the king is, look, you want to transcend suffering. You want to, go deep into this dharma that appears profound. It's hard. It takes a long time. It takes many lifetimes. But if you focus on the infinite sentient beings that there are, you actually have a way of getting there very fast. Remaining for an infinite time and yearning for infinite awakening for the sake of infinite beings, bodhisattvas perform infinite virtue. So how could they not before long obtain awakening, even though it be infinite through the collection of these four that are infinite? So I'm not going to belabor this, but meditate on this because it's an interesting one. Now we're into the conduct of a king. Okay, this is where we get a little tiny bit of art history. There's a lot of advice to the king. Read the book, you'll see there's quite a bit there, but here's a few verses. In a respectful manner, make Buddha images, stupas, and vast monasteries with extensive and richly appointed chambers and so on. So here we have the reference to Buddha images. This is one way that we have of dating Nāgārjuna, is because there was a period when Buddha images weren't made. Here's a model of the Amaravati stupa. It's small compared to what it would be. You can see these gates you would walk in and circumambulate. And a stupa is like a monument to the Buddha's existence and mind. Inside would be relics, and it's richly adorned, as you can see. As he tells the king, from all kinds of precious substances, please make well-drawn, beautifully proportioned images of Buddhas upon lotus flowers. Now we have another clue about date, right? First of all, the fact that he's talking about Buddha images at all tells you we're in a certain era. Now it's Buddhas who are on top of lotus flowers. And here we see also from Amaravati that the Buddha is standing. I don't know if I can show you with my cursor here, standing, and you can't really see it very well, but there's little lotus petals there. And this is again from about this same 2nd century. Prior to that, we don't see Buddhas on top of lotuses, and we don't read about it either. Honor the stupas with offerings of gold and silver flowers, diamonds, coral, and pearls, sapphires, beryl, and emeralds. And here we have an image. It's very broken. from this wonderful site called Kanaganahalli in Karnataka state in India. But there was a huge stupa there. It's nearly all broken up like this, but there's some scholars who've done amazing work putting stuff together. And this one actually has an inscription that names a Satavahana king, saying that he's offering silver lotuses to the stupa. So that's incredible evidence that, kings did offer silver and gold flowers to the stupas to ornament the stupas to gain merit and so on. We move on from that interesting art historical stuff to just give some more general advice to kings. Out of your compassion, always care for the ill, the vulnerable, those afflicted by suffering, and the downtrodden and unfortunate. Earnestly apply yourself to aiding him. This is the basic advice. Just don't neglect anybody, okay? And he's got a long section about what you should put at the side of roads, at the site of cisterns, places like wells, places where people can get drinking water. Place shoes, parasols, and water filters, tweezers for removing thorns, needles, thread, and fans. He's not going to neglect anything. In cool, shady spots, make small cisterns filled with potable water and provided with sesame, rice, grain, food, molasses, and oil. Wouldn't it be nice if we just went outside and all these things were there, provided by the king? And this is amazing. At the opening of anthills, have trustworthy persons constantly place food and water, molasses, and piles of grain. So think about, if sentient beings are infinite, ants are pretty infinite too. And feeding the ants is going to produce a lot of merit, right? If you're a king or not. So that's it. Next time you have ants, please put some molasses, put some, maybe outside and coax them outdoors. Always care expansively for places in the world that are oppressed or where crops have failed, that have suffered harm or where there is plague or that have been defeated in war. Do not be angry when others do harm, but realize that it is the effect of previous karma. Very difficult teaching. Without causing any more suffering, eliminate your own faults. Don't be angry. Realize other people are suffering the result of their own bad deeds. This is what's making them do bad. Without causing any more suffering, eliminate your own faults. For your own sake, always speak the truth, even if that leads to your death or the loss of your sovereignty. Never speak in any other fashion. This is a very harsh teaching for a king to hear because, and as I said, deception's a big theme in this, as is fear. He doesn't want to lose his kingship. Now we get back to the Dharma of the highest good. He brings it back in. Through correctly and truly understanding that all things are essenceless, you will attain the sixth psychic power, the supreme cessation of all defilement. So he's really asking the king to become very detached from his own power. King, it is best not to make a dharma complex if it does not make the hairs of your princely vassals stand on end, since you won't be praised for it even after you're dead. Now I feel like Nāgārjuna is getting a little bit of his own agenda in here. He wants the king to make a really fancy stupa for him. And he's kind of appealing to the king's pride and saying, you want the other people to be impressed, right? Don't make a dinky stupa. Okay, we got to finish now. King, here, how in this world where they usually prey on each other, both the Dharma and a kingdom could still be yours. Out of compassion, you should always focus your mind on benefiting all beings, even those who have committed the most serious sins. You should particularly have compassion for those who have committed the grave sin of murder. Those who have ruined themselves are indeed worthy of great person's compassion. Either every day or every 5 days, release the weakest prisoners. Of the remaining ones, let not there be any who are never released. And until they are released, those prisoners should be made content by providing them with barbers, baths, drink, food, medicine, and clothes. As if you had the intention of making unruly children behave properly, you should discipline them out of compassion, not out of anger or desire for material gain. Having correctly examined and identified wicked murderers, send these people into exile without killing or harming them. And that's it. Now we have the bodhisattva path. There's very little here. But the point is, you've realized that the world is not objectively a world, and one is groundless and free of the basic causes of rebirth. Thus one attains nirvana like a fire whose basic causes have ceased. So this is all about how the Buddha teaches different kinds of dharma to different kinds of beings. But I will just end with these final few verses, which are so beautiful and are reminiscent of Shantideva's teachings, which a lot of you know. Like the earth, water, wind, and fire, medicinal herbs, and the trees of the wilderness, may I always be made use of freely by all beings, just as they wish. This is a prayer he tells the king to recite daily in front of a Buddha image. May I be as beloved to beings, may I be as beloved to beings as life itself, and may they be more beloved to me than myself. May I bear the results of their sins, and may they have the results of all my virtue. As long as there is even a single sentient being somewhere who is not yet free, may I remain in the world for that being's sake, even if I have attained unexcelled awakening. So that's the end of the talk. I know it was a lot to take in. Thank you so much.